Red Norvo playing vibraphone with those mallets of his which are more like dumplings on sticks. They create such a soft effect. Tal Farlow guitar, Hank Jones at the piano, Ray Brown bass, Jake Hanna at the drums. On a lovely album recorded at the 1976 Concord Jazz Festival, now released as On Stage, Concord CJ143. Concord CJ143. 1943 and 1948, specifically for American servicemen. 12-inch 78s pressed on vinyl, most of which were rendered quite unplayable quite quickly through unfair wear and tear in the front line. Furthermore, there was no proper V-disc file as such, no office files. So when Richard Sears, an oil geologist in his full-time occupation, decided to do a discography and history of them, he had little to go on except some surviving records that he found and the memories of the few people who'd been responsible for issuing them. His 1,200-page book came out last year, and we've already talked about it on this program. In a few minutes we'll be hearing Richard Sears himself speaking to me in the loud seclusion of a 7th-floor hotel bedroom, describing how he first came across V-discs. But first, a V-disc itself. The V-disc jumpers, indeed, including Yank Lawson on trumpet, Peanuts Hucko, clarinet, Bud Freeman on tenor, Buddy Weed at the piano, and Ray McKinley on drums. Recorded just after the war, October 1945. Love is just around the corner.
I saw some in the Pacific, and some, of course, there's not much information on the label as to what they might be, but I played them. Some, of course, it was very obvious that these were unique. I didn't know, what they were. And I, like everybody else, I confiscated a few. And when I left in the late 50s, when I went down to British Honduras, or Belize now, I had all of the V-discs and some transcriptions. Put them on, thought I'd better put them on tape. Had a German tape recorder, which as it turns out had an electronic squeal built into it, which I didn't know about until later. I played them back on the same tape machine, and they were good. Well, then, of course, along came a hurricane, and I lost all of the records and all of the transcriptions. I saved my paper, which was lucky, and I saved the tapes. Of course, then I played the tapes back, and I didn't have any music at all. So finally, I was very lucky in two respects. That one was that I made a number of trips to the Library of Congress and found that at first I went in and I just saw their collection, fairly complete but not really cataloged. And the second time I went back, I was given facilities to play any particular ones that I wanted to play for checking. But in the meantime, I had gotten in touch with many people who had V-discs. And I was just amazed at, the cooperation of people. There are exceptions, of course. And, but they all made tapes. I mean, some of them 8 to 10 hours of tapes of everything they had in their collection. These were specialists, so it might be one artist, but then of course they would record the other side, and then they so gradually I built up quite a complete tape library, just in recent years, more for research, and then was able to check the odd one here and there.
When did you start work on the book itself?
The book itself, as a book, the first text was written in Egypt in 1972, so roughly 10 years ago. Prior to that, it was just a continuing compilation of notes, because I found that papers are more portable. I could take a lot of papers. And this was the main reason. It wasn't, the project was when I was out in the jungle, when I was out at a drilling rig or out in the desert. I was, in isolated areas, maybe 3 or 4 weeks at a time or a week. And I found that, particularly, say, if I were out with the Spanish crew, in the evenings they would go off by themselves in a camp, and we would set up a camp, and they'd go off by themselves, and so I was left with the full evening. I found I couldn't take enough books with me. because it was just too much volume to take a lot of books. But I found I could take a large envelope full of papers. So then what I really started to do, and it got to be the fascinating part, the detective part, was to start listing and start correlating the, say, matrix numbers, which everybody said didn't make any sense, and there was no relationship, and they jumped around, and it was very illogical. But by making various lists, I actually was able to work out almost a dating chart from start to finish and block out everything.
15 years and I'm still serving time with that good man of mine. I've been married, beautiful, I just love it.
I could come up with not that such and such a record or a V-disc was recorded in a certain month, but I could say that it was recorded no later than that month. That was it could come back from something from the 1920s up until March of 1946, but it could be no later than March of 1946. And there was one interesting story about this, was the Duke Ellington V-disc of the unbooted character, and people had been guessing sometime 1945, sometime 1946, generally late 1946, and assigning, because of soloists who were present, I mean, it had to be so-and-so because of the dating. Well, I worked out on the dating chart that the latest it could be was March 1946 was the latest, so it couldn't be late 1940s. That's all I really knew. Then when I was lucky enough to get in at the end, an announcer identifies, and there's obviously an audience present because everybody laughs, and he says something to that effect, that takes care of the unbooted character. The voice was very familiar. I'd heard it before in other V-discs, and it happened to be Art Ford, who did announcing on WNEW. So when I was lucky enough to get into the NBC files, which is a miracle to get into the NBC files in New York, and I was looking at every conceivable file, and I found that Art Ford had appeared on a 1945 program with Jerry Jerome's All-Star Band. It was a teenage program which was on WNEW. It was purchased by NBC in 1945. Jerry Jerome gave up the All-Star Band and started to essentially guest conduct orchestras. So well, this is interesting, and this appears in the book, and it's always something to have, what orchestra was on it at what time. Suddenly there was March 25, 1946, Duke Ellington, which fit right into the time frame. It was the only time the Ellington Orchestra was on that program, and Art Ford was the announcer, and so this came out to be the source, and I heard the record of it.
Is it one which is now commercially available?
It may have come out
Be nice
on
to
one of
play
these LPs, I don't know, but it's an interesting record just because of this announcement at the end. But this was the detective. That was the fun thing.
Well, after a bit of fun detective work myself, I discovered that the V-disc unbooted character had achieved unofficial commercial release, but in tiny quantities and not at this moment easily traceable. But although Duke's first commercial release of that number did not appear until the 1950s, he did do one only 4 months after the V-disc for a broadcast transcription, and this is it. Shorty Baker and Taft Jordan on trumpets, Lawrence Brown trombone, Jimmy Hamilton clarinet, unbooted character, recorded by the Ellington Band for a transcription service in mid-1946. We were talking about V-discs, of course, which that was not, and we were talking especially to Richard Sears about his huge discography of V-discs. And one thing I complimented him on was the way he dispensed with a convention of discography layout, whereby you have to plod your way back through minor personnel changes, sometimes over pages of small type, by which time you can't be sure who's on the record in question. I told him I was pleased that he'd made life easier for the user of the book in a hurry.
This was a definite attempt to avoid this situation. I mean, that was deliberate. The other was to avoid abbreviations, to try to spell out everything in full, so that I did not have to have 1 or 2 pages. In other words, to try to keep the introduction, the synopsis of the layout as simple. I think it was done in a little over 1 page, and that's all. No list of abbreviations or lists of what initials meant and so on. So people were constantly referring back and forth. The other one which I wanted to do, and of course all of this took space, extra space, and made the book bigger. The other thing was on the individual layouts of the band was to do all the trumpets on one line, the trombones, and in alphabetical order under each one. Otherwise, you're looking for, say, a trombone, and you have to start at the beginning and trace your way back and forth to find the start of the trombones, and then look at. So this was, in a case of, say, Tommy Dorsey or Glenn Miller, of course, being the leader, then he would be out of alphabetical order, but he would lead off the trombones. But then the rest would be in alphabetical order. And that was done deliberately, just to try to make it simple, so that you could see at a glance who were the reeds, who was in the rhythm section, and you didn't have to dig into a mass of information.
These are slightly esoteric points from the general listener's point of view, but
yes.
The one tremendously interesting thing, I think, for all listeners to jazz is that in listing all the V-discs that you know about, you did uncover a wealth of material recorded during an otherwise recordingless period, when the American Federation of Musicians recording ban was on, which for some companies lasted, I think, over 2 years, 42 to late 44.
Late 44.
I mean, 1 or 2 bought themselves out of it. American Decca, I think, got
and
themselves
Capitol.
off the hook in 1943, so did Capitol, but the other majors were just not recording commercially. Now, you've revealed a tremendous amount of music set down at a period when none other was being recorded by these people.
And of course, this was done on purpose by Bob Vincent, and you know, to do this, to fill a gap, not only a gap of when there were no current recordings, or the recordings they were making were, say, most primarily vocalists accompanied by vocal groups only, or reissues of older material. But I think basically the idea of V-Disc was not only to provide current recordings by a variety of artists, but also to get away from the fact that otherwise the only thing that people could hear, the military personnel could hear all over the world, was what was coming over the loudspeaker, where they had no control. If they didn't like it, they were, you know, all they could do was turn it off. This way, at least the men could get it. If they weren't interested, that was one thing. If they wanted it, they could go in and they could find classical or popular or jazz or big bands or any novelty. It was all there.